On Hamas, the last question on Hamas. I think it's undisputed, and the people also understand that you have to fight against this enemy. Israel has said, we want to destroy Hamas. You want to destroy Hamas? This sounds absolutely reasonable, okay? They want to destroy Hamas. Now the question is, how do you do that? We see in Gaza that they obviously have used millions and billions of aid to construct a very sophisticated tunnel system, which is even more sophisticated than what the Americans have witnessed in Vietnam or what the Americans have witnessed in Iwo Jima in these terrible island wars in the Pacific. How is it conceivable to fulfill this promise to Hamas to destroy Hamas? Is it possible to destroy Hamas? What would you say if you were the field commander, if you were the chief commander of the Israeli army? What would you say to Bibi Netanyahu if he told you, okay, General, destroy Hamas? Can it be destroyed? Can you say something about that? I would say to my civilian superiors that we can certainly go in and kill large numbers of people. But Hamas is more than 40 or 50 or 60,000 fighters. It's an idea. You want to kill the idea, you want to discredit it. You're going to have a lot of trouble relying exclusively on military power for that purpose. So you might want to consider looking at other things that could be done that would rob Hamas of its argument. Now that's not easy. But if you plan to maintain the state of Israel in this region, that's something you have to think about. Historically, the Israelis were instrumental in helping Hamas come into existence because they were good at manipulating various factions in the Islamic world against each other, and that worked to their advantage. Anytime there was a dispute anywhere or conflict, the Israelis would involve themselves with one or both sides. This is an entirely different set of circumstances, as we point out. Now, Hamas seems to be enjoying increasingly not just celebrity within a small area, but the support of the entire Islamic world. People from Indonesia to Morocco are involved now. So, it's an idea. Killing ideas is very difficult. Killing people is easy. And you're never going to kill everyone, which means you're going to breed more opponents down the line. Unless you can line everyone up, all 2.2 million, and gun them down, you're going to get new generations of fighters. That's the problem. So the Israelis have to have a two-pronged approach, so to say. On the one hand, yes, we're going to go in. We're going to inflict damage. We're going to try and undermine it. You talked about tunnels. We used flamethrowers, particularly in the Pacific. I would expect the Israelis to use some fuel air explosive, which is a vapor that ignites and then explodes, robs everything of oxygen, destroys everything. I would expect that to happen in some of these tunnels if they can make it work. In other words, this is a no-holds-bar operation, but if you think that will be the end of it, you're making a mistake. And that's why I would warn the civilian authorities, what have you got in your back pocket in terms of a strategy to deal with the profoundly human dimension of this? What are you going to do? And that would, I think, cause any thoughtful person to back away from wholesale extermination. This is amazing, what you are describing. My impression is, if I look at the pictures now of the warfare of Israel, if I talk to our correspondent in Tel Aviv who, I would say, basically supports the Israel answer, but he says these are very disturbing images we see from Gaza. So if I understand you correctly, what Israel is doing right now is not actually destroying Hamas, but it is even making this monster bigger, and it, puts another, other people will support Hamas because they see, because they see what Israel is doing. Is Israel at the moment acting against its own interest with this kind of warfare? I think so, and I think there are many Israelis who understand this, but they have no voice in the government. And I doubt seriously that their views are being heard by anyone in power. You're listening to the Netanyahu wing of Israeli politics that is out for blood and feels strongly that it has to administer this object lesson or Israel won't survive, as opposed to what I am suggesting, which is if you administer the object lesson, Israel will not survive. That's my argument. So I've said to people that would listen here in Washington, every president at some point has intervened within these conflicts involving Israel. He's usually as a check on Israeli power. In other words, the Israelis crossed the Suez Canal, we said no. after the counterattacks to break through the Egyptian lines. We said, no, we don't want that. Pull back to the other side of the Suez. Then we got a ceasefire, and as a result, we got an agreement which was a very good agreement in the long run between Egypt and Israel. Right now, there is no check on Israeli power. There is no check on power from the United States being employed, and Israel's, I think, a president today is really obligated to save Israel from itself if Israel is to survive. My great fear is that won't happen. The entire region will line up against it, and nothing we do is going to save Israel at that point. You mentioned before the First World War. This is highly interesting, the long roads to the First World War. But I would say there was an interesting nuance or a difference that if you look at the politics in the beginning of the 20th century, my impression from what I've read is that many of the superpowers of today thought that they would actually prevail in this war and they can get something out of it. Everybody had some kind of interest in going into the war and completely misjudging the situation. They thought at the end of it, we will win surely. The Germans thought they will win. The British thought they will win. The French, together with the Russians, thought they will win. And isn't it so today that nobody wants a global war, nobody wants to risk a global war, be it Russia, be it China, be it the United States, even though they seem to have a severe leadership problem in Washington at the moment. So isn't this common interest of the superpowers of today an argument which says we shouldn't panic at the moment? The scenario of a World War III in the Middle East starting there is not so big? What do you say? Are you concerned that a third world war could emerge from this situation? Well, I haven't used the term World War III. I just haven't because I think that if we're exposed to even a fraction of what you're describing, people will be shocked and will reel back in fear of it. Now the good news is that at least in Moscow with President Putin and certainly with President Xi in China, you're talking about two men who have been in political power for at least 20 years. That's a very important point. They're experienced. They also represent countries with long memories and long histories of conflict. That makes a difference. It's helpful because I can tell you that, if anything, everything that both of those men have done since this tragedy in Ukraine began has been to deliberately limit the fight. We have provoked the Russians repeatedly, and the Russians have steadily refused to take the bait. I'll be frank with you. I'm not worried about Moscow and Beijing. I'm worried about Washington, and here's why. We suffer from a terminal case of overweening arrogance. I think used to talk about this before World War I as a complaint. Well, that was modest compared with what goes on in Washington. You hear these people talk about the United States today as though it were 1991, and it isn't. We're not the same country. Our economy is fragile, our financial system is, in my judgment, in ruins, poised for a crisis. Then the population itself, we're dealing with the influx of millions of people that are not us. You have that in Europe, we have it here. We're trying to sort through this. So we're not a cohesive society or nation as we once were. In the midst of all this, everyone seems to think that we are so powerful and so dominant that no one would dare contradict us. That anything we want to undertake will work. That our weapon capabilities are superior. You don't have any reasonable debate in public about the dangers involved. We have completely forgotten war. The last time we had a war that affected Americans was World War II, and remember the last time we had a really major war that killed 1 million of us was the Civil War. So you have a different mentality here. It's a combination of arrogance and, I would also say, ignorance. There's no understanding of the Middle East, just as there's no understanding of Eastern Europe. I've said several times, what are we doing in Ukraine? We don't know anything about Ukraine. We don't know anything about Russia. Certainly, some of us do. But the broader population doesn't. They look at what's happening in Israel and say, well, it's these Arabs again. We just have to help them defeat these people. But it's not that simple. It's a much larger problem. And by the way, there's this perception that everyone there, including Iran and Turkey, is backward. There's no appreciation for the professional competence of the Turkish armed forces or, for that matter, the Iranian armed forces. These people are, in fact, sophisticated. They have advanced air and space capabilities, advanced missile technology, and particularly the soldiers that serve in the Turkish army, they're ferocious fighters. They're very good soldiers. There's no sense of that. So I think that's the problem. Arrogance and ignorance in Washington, and then the feeling that this is Israel's moment to deal decisively with its opponents, to administer this important object lesson. Remember that throughout its history, the Israelis have always felt that if a single Jew in Israel is harmed, you must immediately strike back and crush the source where Jews will never be safe. Well, here we sit. We've done that. It hasn't worked very well, and now they think this is the time to strike the final blow. I would rather not see this progress to the point where everyone thinks it's the final blow. I'm sure you understand that's extremely interesting what you're saying. I mean, this reminds me in a horrifying way about Serbia, where the Austrians thought now we have to solve the Serbian problem, and the Germans have to help us, and they thought they would solve a local problem, and by solving this problem, which they didn't, they created a huge mess, a First World War. Is something like that probable to happen now in the Middle East, that the unhinged Israelis walk into Gaza thinking together with the Americans, with the West, we are so strong we can fight this down to the end. We can solve this problem for good, and at the end they reap a much stronger storm from other countries, and even the Russians and the Chinese could say now is the time to teach the West the lesson. This arrogance has to stop, as they did with the Germans. They want to collectively punish the Americans and the arrogant Westernists epitomized by the Israeli, and we end up in a third world war. How probable is a scenario like this? Well, it's not impossible. It's more probable than I would like to admit, and that's exactly what I've worried about. Of course, we're not prepared for that. By the way, in 1914, only 40% of the Imperial German Army had field gray uniforms. So the Germans were not prepared for a major war either. And of course, everybody thought the same thing. You'll all be home by the time the leaves fall. That was, of course, the Kaiser's announcement. You know, the sad truth is, man forgets. We forget repeatedly, and what I'm trying to point out is that the American memory is different from the European memory. Our recollections of the past are shaped by fantasy in many cases. We think that we were better than we were, that we are greater than we are, and we refuse to accept the possibility that we're simply a great power. We may be strongest in many respects of the great powers, but we're just a great power. There are other great powers. That's a problem, and no politician wants to stand up and tell Americans the truth. They all want to stand up. We're the greatest people in the world. There's nothing. Listen to Biden. He's talking as though it's 1941. Lisa Graham. Yeah, I mean, it's absurd. These people are out of touch with reality, and all this World War-style rhetoric is, I would say, falling on a lot of deaf ears. It's back to what I said at the beginning. Most Americans aren't really engaged anyway.